Hey, what's going on? This is the Saturday Down South podcast. I am Connor O'Gara. Will, by the time people are listening to this, I realize they will be dialed into the madness, which we can call it. I definitely will be. Can't beat the tournament. The entertainment value is, as good as it gets. And I say that as a college football guy. But, man, there's nothing college football can do, even if they expand to every single FBS team, that's ever going to quite compete with the first 2 days of the NCAA tournament. I don't feel like I'm turning my back on football to say that.
Of course. And I mean, naturally, you feel like Indiana can win it all.
That was just mean. I'm sitting here trying to appreciate the fact. No, we don't need to go down this road because I was going to say something mean back. And then I thought, you know what? I don't need to bring up the fact that LSU is one of two SEC teams that didn't make the NCAA tournament. I don't need to bring that up today. That's negative energy. We're not here
because we both cheer for football schools. That's the key, right? And hey, Indiana made the CFP last year, so they're ahead of LSU technically.
Football school. That's what it is. And ironically enough, that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. We have great show coming up. Adam Breneman is going to join us in a little bit. We discussed how the coaching profession, really at the top, is getting younger. Beau Pribula, a guy coming over from Penn State to Mizzou. He's got some great insight on him. And then we end with some lazy tight end comps that you're going to want to stick around for.
Perfect.
But first, Will, can SEC basketball ever overtake SEC football? A question that, feels like it's an appropriate thing to at least ask this, because while we are a football podcast, and I have said before, we're not going to dig into the weeds of basketball. There are other great places that can do that. I think this is a question that could be discussed, as, basketball interest in the SEC has never been greater than it is right now. Peak interest, 14 teams in, the contenders that are at the top of the SEC. If there is ever a time to at least entertain this thought, now is probably the only time we can really do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, not to get too ahead of ourselves, but I think that ultimately fandom and college sport fandom for sure is very tied to what your specific school is good at. So I think there is something to that, in talking to my stepbrother, Alan, huge Bama fan, self-proclaimed Gump. He is like a college basketball diehard, right? Because of the great things that Nate Oates has done right now. Meanwhile, my team, as you've mentioned, is sorry. And so therefore watching SEC basketball outside of my boys, they're Kentucky fans. I'll do a little bit of, rooting here and there for Alabama, Auburn, depending on who they're playing. But watching SEC basketball mostly makes me sad because I'm watching my team puke all over their shoes. And so I think it's very related to that, where people would forever have said, I would never, consider this equal. But it's like, well, now look at you. You're dialed into a weekday matchup against Purdue or whatever non-conference team you're playing.
And look, I think that's great. And I will not tell anyone that they should be less interested. If you want to jump all aboard the bandwagon, starting in March, fine. College basketball is set up perfectly for that. I'm admittedly a bit like that myself, as someone who obviously does the football stuff for a living and basketball stuff pretty much when March rolls around for SDS. And SEC basketball, to me, as a kid living in the suburbs of Chicago, meant nothing. Whereas SEC on CBS, that was the thing that I would leave Indiana football tailgates to go home and watch with my college buddies. And I feel perfectly fine admitting that for different people, they have different sort of nostalgia feels for whatever sort of, I don't want to say association they have with SEC basketball, but for me, it was just entirely different growing up. And the question isn't necessarily whether SEC basketball is of greater interest right now than SEC football, which, look, SEC football, with all the spring games that are being canceled, you don't have a whole lot of reason to talk a lot of current football things. If you've noticed on the pod here, we haven't necessarily gotten into the football weeds of current events because there just hasn't been as much going on, and that's fine. We're not, probably going to be talking about Auburn's inside linebackers instead of discussing, whether Bruce Pearl's team can flip the switch back to looking like the team that had 16 quad one wins. If you're just having these normal conversations with people, a normal Auburn fan, they're talking about the latter and not so much what's going on 6-7 months from now in football. Everyone's all in with basketball. They should be. A lot of people have been more dialed in earlier than ever because when the SEC recorded that 89 winning percentage in non-conference play, the best since 1983-84 UNC. It was clear from the jump that this was going to be a historic year for the SEC. Mizzou didn't win a conference game last year, and then it beat number one Kansas in the non-conference play. Stuff like that. Auburn fighting on a plane, turning the plane around, deciding, you know what, we got things figured out. We're still going to go into Houston and win that game. These things happened, and they were all part of this preamble to a great year for the SEC, as well as a 14-2 SEC beatdown of the ACC in the ACC-SEC Challenge. Sorry, Danny Cannell, the season-long hype machine was justified, even for a conference that still has the ultimate elephant in the room, which is 0 national titles since 2012, 0 Final Four victories since 2014. That's a long time. That's more than a decade that we're talking about here. And there will be a lot of people that are rooting against the SEC because they want that to continue, and they don't want the SEC to go from this football bravado to all of a sudden having it in basketball. So there will be that pushback. And maybe that's the first sign that the SEC basketball is growing. If you don't have haters, you're not good.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just reality. And if the SEC fails to change that drought with 14 teams in the tournament, everyone will point and laugh, which could prompt plenty of those bandwagon fans that I talked about jumping off the bandwagon and saying, this doesn't hurt me. That's fine. Football hurts me way more. I get that. You could make the case that the SEC is a baseball conference now, based on how deep the conference is. 5 different programs have won a national title in the last 5 years. But while some of the baseball diehards, the seam heads, that's what we call them,
right?
They might disagree with this notion, but college baseball will just never have the same appeal as college basketball. Okay. It won't. And I'm sorry, like NCAA tournament is a huge part of that. I love the College World Series. I love Omaha. I'm locked in that time of year, but go ask 100 college sports fans what their favorite sporting event is to watch every year. And I'd be stunned if 10 said the College World Series. That's not hating on baseball, but I mean, you're a fan of a team that won a national championship in the last 5 years. Is that a fair thing to say, or am I being too lazy with that?
Yeah, I think it is important here to make a distinction between, a random regular season game, like I was talking about, and March Madness, because I think that if you polled most of America, you would get a pretty big contingent that says, maybe Super Bowl #1, March Madness #2 for their favorite sporting event. So I think you almost have to take March Madness as a separate entity because everybody's dialed in for March Madness. You know what I'm saying? So I think for regular season wise now in the SEC, you could make an argument that certain fan bases are more dialed into baseball, and maybe that's definitely rising the profile of a weekend series, for instance, because that feels a little bit more staccato to me. It feels a little bit more set up. Okay, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, we're out of here. Versus, okay, which network is this in? What do we do? So yeah, I think that regular season wise, they're a little bit closer than people would think. But I think once you get into that postseason, there's nothing, touching the big dance.
Yeah, the efficiency of it is unmatched. You just can't do that anywhere else. To have, this game just ended on True TV. Let me go flip on CBS. Let me go flip on TNT. And you get that. It's bang, bang, bang. And it's really, 4 days of it that you get that type of chaos wherein there's a ton of overlap. And that's just a unique experience that nobody else is going to quite be able to simulate. And that, of course, has been the driving force for college basketball for a very long time. I'm not breaking.
And let me ask you this question, though. Do you think the CFP will ever get to where March Madness is? Because I might even say no to that.
Yeah, I don't think it will from that same sort of experience. It's just much more of a commitment to sit down and watch these games, which don't get it twisted. I love what we have now with that Friday, Saturday setup where you can watch a game Friday night and know that pretty much from the moment that you wake up on Saturday, have breakfast, you're going to be watching playoff football the entire day with the way that those games are staggered 4 hours apart. That's incredible. And that is the closest I think college football will come to that. It gets a little bit messy if you try and say, well, in a given college football Saturday, obviously there's potential to be chaos and there can be afternoon windows that are bonkers. They also aren't necessarily appointment viewing in the same way that the NCAA tournament is. And it's a lot less, it's more unpredictable. And that's the tough thing, is that you can't truly simulate that type of viewing experience for college football. It's a different type of thrill. And there's a reason why we don't call it college football madness.
Yeah.
You just don't. But to me, this is what's always made SEC football such a unique beast. And it's worth remembering as we talk about the brand of SEC basketball. It's not just the attendance. It's not just the buyouts paid to fire coaches. It's not even just the success. Because remember, SEC baseball obviously has that in spades. Other sports do as well. Women's basketball is having an unbelievable run here, and maybe that's going to continue this year as well. What is the default conversation? When it's not peak season, when it's not, hey, we're opening round of the NCAA tournament, we're talking college basketball. What is the default conversation where you go to a summer barbecue and what are people talking about?
Mm-hmm. Or on our boy Paul's show, if you're calling and asking questions, it's mostly going to be about that left tackle in the offseason until we get to this point where every team has some skin in the game. We're getting closer and closer. I'm with you there.
I'm going to be on Feinbaum, 2 hours from now? But I guess by the time people are listening to this, I'll have already been on. Maybe I made a fool of myself and dragged my family's name through the mud. But this is one of the few times of the year that I know going on, I won't be talking football.
Mm-hmm.
Every other time, the default's going to be football. And maybe that's just because it's a football-centric show, and Paul's bread and butter is football, but it's on the SEC Network. This kind of, you can say you wish you had more of this on the SEC Network. You wish you had more of that. But Feinbaum very often defaults to what are people interested in? What are people calling about? What's going to actually get the phone lines buzzing after an interview? And that's why for the vast majority of the year, we're talking football. Football is still going to be the thing that is most often discussed in SEC circles. And when I go on these shows, like I'm just not getting people that are going to reach out to me at mid-November that are asking me to break down hoops. It's just not going to happen. Whereas, January, February, am I still going on shows like that and talking football? Absolutely. Absolutely. Sometimes it's leading with what's current. Maybe we're talking about March Madness, or maybe it's, peak of College World Series, something like that. We're talking about that. And then we get to the football questions.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I have a very skewed viewpoint of that because the majority of what I do is football. And so people would assume that. I don't sit there and live tweet baseball. I don't sit there and live tweet basketball games, that aren't necessarily part of the SEC or NCAA tournament. Okay. That's just not in my personality. That's not typically how I'm going to spend my time. Even if I'm watching them, that's just not what I would typically do. But I just wonder, is that ever going to change? Will it? I don't know. Let's get back to the question at hand here.
Mm-hmm.
Can SEC basketball ever overtake football? Whatever your interpretation of that is. And if that answer is yes, what would that look like? Any chance of that happening in our lifetime, I think it would have to be in the works as we speak.
Yeah.
It is a two-way street because it's not just as simple as win more games in basketball. I think we would need significant developments in both SEC basketball and SEC football to make me ever say that the SEC is a basketball conference before it's a football conference. And I realize there are a lot of people listening to this saying, Connor, why can't we just be an everything conference? Why can't that be?
They are. Yeah, that's the thing. You only have 24 in the day, folks. You can't be talking about SEC wiffle ball as you're going to bed or your wife will divorce you. So
are we sure? Do we know?
We haven't found out. I'll let you test that one.
Did you see this riser that I found on YouTube? I don't know. I'm just saying.
Mm-hmm.
You can embody that. And if you're Greg Sankey, you can go anywhere with a microphone and say that. That's perfectly fine. But at a time in which revenue sharing and a $20.5 million piece of the pie is being divvied among its student athletes, that stuff is more important than just a conversation piece. So what do those developments look like, those potential developments for SEC basketball that would be working in its favor? I think for starters, the SEC would need to go on this 1980s Big East run.
Mm-hmm.
It is the 40-year anniversary of the Big East having 3 of the 4 teams in the Final Four. Villanova ends up winning the national championship, stunning Georgetown, one of the biggest upsets in the history of the sport. The Big East became the brand in college basketball. It did so because of a few things. They prided themselves on being a basketball conference, and they didn't prioritize football. until they were trying to keep a few schools happy and trying to keep a few schools from leaving for bigger conferences. And so they tried to say like, oh, let's see if we can get Penn State on board to help our football brand, help out, our football needs for these
Miami,
schools. Miami's the perfect example. They brought in Miami to be able to do that. We need to help out these schools that aren't just basketball schools, the Jesuit schools or something like that. And they end up leaving these tiny gyms and going into the giant stadiums. That's something that is in a different way becoming a more popular topic of discussion in the SEC at places like Bama, at places like Auburn. They had in the Big East the ultimate stage because they got in at the ground floor with ESPN. And at a time when I think monoculture still existed, even as the cable era with TV was beginning, the Big East became appointment viewing for anyone with cable. And there are still people that if you listen to them, people that are in the over 40 crowd will still tell you about how great it was to watch, Big East basketball on Monday night and how they would just do that. They're going to tune into any one of these games. And the SEC will never be in a position where it will have such a stranglehold on sports TV in the way that it did. Even as these contracts reach these ridiculous levels, it will still never be that because there's just more programming available. But here's what the SEC does have that the Big East could not corral. It already has the long-term, huge revenue TV contract that coexists with football. It's not in competition with it, and it's not worrying about what someone else is going to get to leave the conference because they are prioritizing football. Football doesn't lurk for the SEC's future like it did with the Big East. It instead can continue to...
It's the elephant in the room, and it's actually a physical elephant. It's Big L.
It's there. Yeah. It's literally
there he is. Yeah.
But it's making you money. And
right. It's accepted. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what's I think different is that it can fund those improvements that we've seen in the SEC with basketball over the course of the last 5 years. One of those big improvements that I think we've seen that's been the biggest reason why SEC basketball is at a better place than it's been in a really long time, maybe ever, is coaching. Obvious. Coaching turned the Big East into the force that it was in college basketball in the 80s. Coaching has turned the SEC into the force that just set the record for most teams in the NCAA tournament. 6 of the top 12 highest paid coaches in college basketball from the SEC. College basketball is actually getting older with its coaches, which is oddly reflected in the SEC. Outside of Todd Golden, so many of these guys are 50 and up now, which Bruce Pearl, Rick Barnes, John Calipari, those guys are 65 and up and still doing it, which is kind of crazy to think about. Dan Wetzel wrote about this for ESPN, how 5 of the top 7 teams in the NCAA tournament are coached by guys 65 and older. Isn't that weird?
That's fascinating. And I would just, as a layman, guess that, okay, the NBA is moving towards like way younger coaches that are like former players and stuff. And so it feels like the college is going the other way. We talk about craving stability, right? Program builders. Like I'm going to bring in a program builder who's going to get his system, his style of recruit, that style of stuff. And I feel like the whiz kid mantra hasn't gone as well in college, whereas it feels like we've had some guys, including, our defending champion Boston Celtics with younger coaches in Missoula that have been successful at that level. So it's almost like if you're a young, like firebrand guy, you either kind of do the like lower level college and then go to the NBA, or you start in the NBA, because the skills that are now required to be a college basketball coach, even crazier than football, it's just been around for longer with, okay, we had under the table payments. Now we have over the table payments. Now we got to get guys in the portal and convince them to stay and guarantee them stuff. So yeah, we don't really talk about how much weirder and harder it is to manage college basketball because it's been so expected out of college basketball that guys get guarantees. But it's a really weird job right now to be a top-level college basketball coach.
Yeah, especially with the portal now, too. It's crazier in college basketball than it is in college football with the windows and the way that it sets up and the year-round recruiting and all that. It is more of a thing to juggle with basketball than it is with football. So as it relates to this SEC basketball window, if you looked at the ages of those coaches in the SEC, you would say, well, maybe because the sport is getting older, maybe that window isn't quite as small and as narrow as some might think, because it's set up to for a little bit more long-term success. And coaches are, until we see this mass exodus of those coaches, and all of a sudden it's like, all right, if Tom Izzo retires, he's kind of the last of that generation. There are obviously guys that have stepped down, a Jay Wright or something like that. But until we start seeing all of those guys decide, you know what, I just don't have the time for this. This is not me and the sport that I fell in love with. I think it's perfectly fine to admit that coaches are getting older in college basketball. I think that's something that works in the SEC's favor. It's why the answer to this question isn't just a flat never. It exists, but it's going to need several different SEC programs winning college basketball national titles in the 2020s.
Okay.
I think in the 21st century, maybe I have a different perspective on this than you would. I think the ACC, the Big East, and the Big 12 have all had the most juice as basketball conferences.
I think the Big Ten would tell you different, but I think we're aligned that, okay, congrats.
Buddy, I went to a Big Ten school. I went to a basketball school. When you haven't won a national title in 25 years, I don't think you get to claim that you are that specific sport conference. I just don't think it works like that. And with those three conferences, the ACC, the Big East, and the Big 12, all of them had multiple teams win titles in a 5-year window. That's how you generate interest. The SEC was definitely a football brand before 2006, of course, but what established the notion so strongly that it was the premier football conference and what became such a huge part of SEC culture was that from 2006 to 2012, 4 different SEC schools accounted for all 7 national titles. That's huge. And for people that are 25 years old even, you remember that time. And that's part of growing up. It's unrealistic to suggest that the SEC can do that in basketball just because you got 3 times as many teams and the tournament's just far too random to say that that's the barometer for success. But what if in the latter half of the 2020s, the SEC rattles off 4 titles, let's say, while football endures a drought of not just missing out on national titles, but missing out on even getting to the game. And that interest flips earlier than ever. Maybe I guess not earlier than ever in terms of how the calendar works now because the season is pushed. You get what I'm saying. If before the national championship, SEC fans have already turned the page. Would that be the start of it? I think, yeah, that would be the start. You'd also have so much interest and resources thrown into correcting that football problem that there would still be conversations about it. And it wouldn't be all of a sudden, oh, there's this disinterest. It's not like that alone is suddenly putting SEC football into the back seat. You couldn't suddenly see 9 to 10 SEC football programs have their attendance fall off at the start of basketball season. You know, that's the scenario I cannot envision happening. The expanded playoff is going to help keep SEC football's floor high. And one would think if we're talking about 4 auto bids in a couple of years for the SEC, that floor is as high as it can possibly be. The NCAA tournament has kept college basketball's floor incredibly high, even through the one and done era, even through the transfer portal era, like all these different things that have changed the sport since we were growing up and we knew it to be a certain thing. In some ways, maybe it'll continue SEC basketball's, it's going to limit its ceiling in that respect. And maybe there will only be a certain amount of interest that can be generated in the regular season because everything obviously comes down to what happens in March. We do, however, have to keep that perspective. We also know that these things, they take time. They take a long time. Traditions take a long time to wear off, and some never do. I am now just getting to a place where I'm about to turn 35 years old. I'm about to be finally accepting that the Cubs are not a huge emotional interest in my life. And probably because of 2016, if they still hadn't won one, it'd be different. But I am like now kind of, and I'm not going to wake up and watch them lose to the Dodgers in Japan at 5:30 in the morning. I don't need to do that.
Okay, you know what? This is actually a great time. I was going to try to figure out where I could pause and say this. That is such a good example. It's the best example I could have possibly given, right? I've often talked to fans of different fan bases. You guys know I've had lots of fans in Orlando that are UCF fans. And I've often said, it's not about how things are when you're winning. It's about how things are when you're losing.
Yes.
And my feedback to UCF fans was always, when you have struggles, as they do now, will you show up? Yeah, you're not watching Scott Frost smoke all your rivals and you're going on game day and you're pumping your chest. What is it when you're a middle tier, Big 12 school? And they've done pretty solid there. It's obviously not what it was, right? But the Cubs are such a great example because your existence as a Cubs fan was, for lack of a better term, suffer.
Yes.
Right? And I think it's how often you're willing to suffer for something that isn't guaranteed. So do I have time to derail you here? Would you rather finish your point?
I think Nebraska is a great example of that.
Yep.
I talked to so many people during my time there that knew the 90s, and they were going to keep showing up to those games no matter what, even if they were out of playoff contention, they were out of Big Ten championship contention. They would show up because they grew up loving this. And even when the team is not particularly good, it's everything. And you could still run Nebraska football stories every single day at the newspaper that I worked in, 2 hours from Lincoln, because that fan interest, even when they were losing, is still there. And it would take another probably 10 years of irrelevance for that to wear off, for them to all of a sudden have closer to disinterest. It'll never be true disinterest, but that's when you can really feel like things have changed, when there's disinterest and it's not just as simple as like, oh, hey, our team's not good. Like, we're not all in anymore.
Yes, I fully agree. And so I would actually push back on winning championships being the thing that moves the needle, because I'll put it to you like this, right? We've seen fan bases get together over softball, women's basketball in LSU's case. I think South Carolina has a little bit more ingrained than LSU does at this point. I'll give them full credit on that. But we've seen, baseball fan bases, the Mississippi schools, you pick these things up for a season. But when it comes to really caring if your team loses, I think you hit on that with the Cubs thing. I have a little exercise I want to try if it doesn't take too much time. I'm going to do talk to my buddies in Kentucky. I'll never forget this conversation. 11 years ago, it was 2014, and they had gotten a 5-star. I believe his name was Matt Elam. Yes, and I remember the board. They were like football only fans, and they were like, "Would you rather have this 5-star or would you rather have like Andrew Wiggins?" And the fan base was going back and forth over it. So I want to do a quick exercise here, if we have, if time permits, and I'm going to give you a fan base, and I want to say, okay, you can have the number 1 rated recruit in a class in football. Let's assume he's a quarterback. I'm not talking about a ridiculous guy. We're just gonna make up a guy. Let's say it's Bryce Underwood. Okay. Or the number 1
We're gonna make up a guy who already exists.
Right. No, exactly. But like for 2 cycles, for next cycle, like don't think about a specific guy. Don't think about, oh, well, the number 1 guy, I'm not excited about him. I'd rather take this guy. I mean, let's say these guys are perfect prospects. Okay. Alabama. Do you think they're taking the quarterback or do you think they're taking the center?
Quarterback all day.
All day. Arkansas is a good one.
Arkansas might be the best one to ask. Arkansas is probably the closest. I think the desperation in football, I think that would just be different. I think they're a
lot closer to that 5-star in basketball too. So I think right now,
with Cal, for sure.
Yeah,
for sure.
I think specifically they take football right now. Maybe 3 years ago they might have thought differently.
Even with Muss, though, they were still getting McDonald's All-Americans. Yeah,
true. Auburn.
It's the one that's changing the most.
Yep.
And it's changing the most because of losing seasons in football and what Bruce Pearl has been able to build in basketball.
Yep.
I'd say basketball. I'm going to say basketball. But it's tough because if you think about it and say, compare Bo Nix to the biggest Auburn basketball recruit, Jabari Smith. What was a bigger deal?
Bo's a little different because he's a legacy.
Yeah,
he's a little different because he's a legacy, though. But you're right, because I watched his dad play. But that's such a good one because here's my thought. It's like, I don't know if Freeze will do anything with that guy, but I know Pearl will. And,
it's a good point.
Yeah. So I think right now,
slight nod to hoops. Slight nod to hoops.
I think that 1 5-star quarterback, even if it's Bryce Underwood, would not get Auburn closer to contention. And I couldn't. So I think they're right there. And it's because of it. This is the exact point we're making. It is some struggle on the football side, right? If we were middle of like Cam Newton era and Pearl was doing this, it'd be great, but it would still, be second. Florida.
I'm still going to say football. And I say this as someone who picked Florida to win a national championship in basketball. But here's the best way to look at this. What would be a bigger deal? DJ Lagway popping? Walter Clayton Jr., first team All-American.
Yep.
Lagway popping is still going to be a bigger deal.
I think the Florida guys have seen exactly what a 5-star quarterback could do. I think they take that guy. You're right.
But it's changed. It's changed to it's different than it was 30 years ago when Lon Kruger left Florida infamously to go to what he called a basketball school, Illinois, and did so because basketball was not at the forefront of the culture at Florida during the Spurrier era. Billy Donovan obviously changed so much of that. It is closer than a lot of people would think. But I would still give the hat nod to Florida football.
Yeah, Florida, Auburn, Arkansas. If you guys are fans, listen to this. Let us know. I'd love to know what you have to say. Georgia, I think is easy. Football, they even had
easy.
Those guys. Yeah, easy. Kentucky, I think basketball still
basketball. Easy. Yep. Not even close.
I think that's easy. LSU, easy football. I think at this stage, because basketball is horrible, that's pretty easy to move past. Even if you told me LSU is going to get this guy, I would be like, cool. I don't know about that. I would rather just get some guys from Brian Kelly. I'm tired of defending him. All right, Mississippi State. I think
it's football. It's football.
I think it's football.
No, it's still football. No disrespect. Love me some Josh Hubbard.
Yep.
Big fan of little guys that can ball. Look, I think that's still the default. That's still going to be the default at so many different places. A&M is another one where I think I'm maybe the biggest Buzz Williams fan outside of College Station. I wanted him for the Indiana job. I'm not afraid to admit that. But it's still you gotta make the side-by-side comp. And I know that a basketball player has more impact there, but what is considered to be a bigger deal? That's what's so much. I think A&M, though,
now that you say that, I think they've had so many 5-stars in football that have not paid off for them. I think that would just be one more in the pile. Whereas a 5-star in basketball, I think they might actually take that because they haven't seen that movie. You know,
maybe, yeah, it's certainly possible. I just think what would it mean for A&M to get to the SEC championship in football? We've seen them get to the SEC tournament championship in basketball, but getting there in football, a place they haven't been to, a place that. Look, they had to watch Texas get there year one. Football still wins that conversation.
Mizzou.
Mizzou. Gosh, that's tough.
They're a hard one too.
That's a little bit tougher because they're not as ingrained in the SEC in that same sort of way. I would still give a slight nod to football.
I agree. Oklahoma, football. Ole Miss, football. South Carolina, I still think is football. Tennessee.
If Drink went winless in SEC play, he gets fired. Dennis Gates doesn't get fired after he goes winless in SEC play.
That's a good point. It's more games too. That's a really good point. So I think South Carolina football. Tennessee, I think it's still football. I think it's
trying to become the ultimate everything school. Tennessee is.
Yes,
and having a lot of success in doing that.
And I think too, like with the Rick Barnes thing with Tennessee, it's like it's never been really a talent problem. It's still kind of a coach thing. So it's not like giving him the greatest talent. He's had some of the greatest talent of all time. I don't think that would move the needle in the way that a 5-star, like I said, quarterback, wide receiver would. Nico is that guy too. I remember like the excitement around Nico. I think that's kind of it.
It's a good exercise though. I like that because that's kind of the way that we have to be talking about this. If we're talking about overtaking a sport.
It's hopium. It's what do you hope happens? Not if I could give you a title, I'd take a football title. But when you get this guy, how locked in would you be to his struggling freshman season? You know?
Yeah, exactly. How much would that be a part of your fandom? And how much would it consume you? That's really what so much of this comes down to. But yeah.
And Texas, last one, football.
Yes, not even close. Easy. Not even. Arch Manning compared to Trey Johnson. Trey Johnson's like going to be a lottery pick. Still wouldn't be able to go in that direction. But yeah, look, I think indifference takes a long time. It really does. And there are certain people, maybe people even listening to this, that would say NIL has made me more indifferent than I've ever been. Maybe it's going to continue to go in that direction. We'll look up 10 years from now and say, wow, big revenue sports, it's not as fun as it used to be as a result of NIL. I'm not saying that's my viewpoint. I'm saying maybe that's the viewpoint of some. And you could argue that NIL having more impact on basketball than football right now, at least in terms of how a roster is constructed, maybe that's not going to hurt football in the way that some think it will. But yeah, I do think turnover and randomness of college basketball will probably prevent the conference from having a 7-year run like what we saw with SEC football from 2006 to 2012. But if this does ever happen, I think it would take 20 years. And here's why. I think it would need to begin this year. Any sort of SEC basketball takeover of SEC football would have to start this year, and it would have to be the start of the SEC winning the majority of basketball national titles over the course of the next 10 years. Maybe that wouldn't even truly be enough to allow the SEC basketball brand to overtake football. But I say 20 years because you would need kids being born into it right now who know no other way. Yep. And they have to know a different world than the one that you and I know. The kids born 20 years ago, they go, wait, America is baseball's pastime? Don't you mean football? What are you talking about? Or maybe the NBA? No. That is what changes generations. That is what changes perception of the way that it is consumed.
Looking at you, Floyd Money Mayweather. Stop ducking people. Boxing used to be America's. I remember even in my youth getting up for the Roy Jones fights. And that's a fight. That's a sport that stars have just said, we don't want to fight anybody. Anyway.
Can't say I got a lot in common with Floyd Mayweather. Can't say that I do. Our height? 5'8", maybe? I don't know. My guess is that this is never truly going to take place, where we will be able to definitively say SEC basketball has overtaken SEC football. I don't think we'll get to that place. I still think the SEC can continue to be the premier conference in college basketball, and it could have, maybe depending on how you value success, it could end up having more success than football over the course of the next 10 years. That's not out of the realm of possibility. I just think that if we're talking about what's more ingrained in a conference's identity, football is going to be that unless we see a drastic change.
Yeah, and I'd say too, it's like regardless of how you view it, this is the beginning, right? Because if there were some type of cultural revolution, and I'll say it this way, right? When you look back at that old Big East, right? They had such an identity. There was such this is Northeast City gridlock football. Our coaches are from here. Our players are they're Italian. They're these big city folks. And like a unique guy is John Thompson, right? I mean, this is a guy who's from Arlington County, Virginia, who is like in my opinion, the greatest like black coach maybe of all time, where it comes to the amount of, men he led and developed and the amount of, NBA Hall of Famers he coached and all that. And that was a man who was of his era, very different in the way he built the Georgetown brand, kind of being that lightning rod that was very progressive, I think is really cool. So the part of it too, is you look up and down SEC football and you see a lot of guys from the South who look like my family from the South. Okay. And I think that while we're still in the era of importing coaches from all over the country, which is the exact right move, don't get it twisted. Don't go hire, Jim Bob from Tuscaloosa down the street to go lead Alabama. That's not what I'm saying. But once there's this love of basketball in the Southeast, there are going to be more coaches that are Southern. And when you start to see yourself in your sports, that's where you really start to buy in, because you say, okay, this represents me in the same way that, St. John's was represented. Hey, they're represented perfectly now by Pitino. By the way, that good.
It's a good point, because Georgetown was a national brand.
Mm-hmm.
Our SEC basketball programs in position to ever become a national brand, where people say, oh, I just love Tennessee basketball.
Mm-hmm.
That's hard. I feel like there are starting to be people that'll say, I just love Houston. I just think the way that Calvin Sampson's teams play year after year, and Tennessee, obviously very similar style. I just love the way that this team defends, and they just seem brutal to play against for 40 minutes. Georgetown benefited from having something like that. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to change the way that people think about you nationally, it's almost like you got to be picking sides. The SEC, I don't think will ever get to that place where all of a sudden it's like, oh, are you a Georgetown fan or are you a Syracuse fan? You know what I mean? Like, you're not going to generate interest in that sort of way. And to be fair, it's not that the SEC does that in football either. There are not a whole lot of people who, when Alabama and Tennessee are playing, are like, hey, I'd much rather see Alabama win than Tennessee or something like that, unless you're, really, really into it. But I do think that's a big part of what can change the brand, the culture, the identity of a conference.
Yeah, and Alabama, Auburn too, right, have faced, again, a slight step back for the University of Alabama is not winning 12, 13 games a year. I get it. But their basketball team is awesome. Same deal with Auburn. So we've seen the Iron Bowl rivalry is always the one that people look at.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think in terms of national brands, I think Kentucky will always be a national brand. I can imagine Drake in the Kentucky warm-ups right now. I think wherever Calipari goes will be a national brand.
Sure.
We're starting to see that with Arkansas. I think Bruce Pearl can do that. I'm not as sure that Nate Oates can, because Bruce Pearl is so gregarious in front of a microphone and he has some of that old school Big East bravado to him. I think Nate Oates is every bit as good of a coach. And his style to me is a lot more, okay, you play this type of style, you come play for us. But I think in terms of national brands, Bama's about right there. But I think those are the ones in the SEC, unless I'm like forgetting anyone, you know?
I think you have to be more unique than Auburn is.
Okay.
Not disrespect to Auburn. I think a program like Georgetown was so unique
at
the time of when they came up. You talk about having a black head coach at that time who can recruit the Patrick Ewings, the Alonzo Mournings of the world. And there were people that really identified with that. And you could wear a Georgetown hoodie and people will know kind of where you stand in terms. They infiltrated pop culture in a way that, with all due respect to Auburn basketball, probably not happening. Probably not. You can like the fact that Nate Oates wants to get up and down the floor, play defense sometimes, take a lot of threes, and you could say, oh, I think that's a fun style of basketball. I'd love to play for that or something like that. I'm a big Mark Sears guy. I've been saying that for a long time. But to truly change how people feel about you, you have to have that national interest, or at least covet that national interest. Whereas, I just think it's a little bit harder to get into that space to truly change the minds of people. Like, are people, if we see two SEC basketball teams in the Final Four, will there be this conference pride? Will there be national pride that are pulling for or against Bama or a Florida or a Tennessee in the way that there were back then? I don't know. And maybe that just means it's tougher to truly establish that brand in a way that, like, UNC and Duke, they have the history to establish something like that. And that's kind of just speaks to my point. This takes a long time. It takes a long time to get to this place unless you have the benefit of monoculture like the Big East had.
Yep, exactly. Look, we got to colonize North Carolina. Call McGee back up. We're going to add them. We're going to teach all these Southerners how to play basketball. It's going to be over for them because now we've decided North Carolina is part of the South. So there you go.
There we go. I like that. That's really good. But yeah, thought this would be a fun time to be able to discuss this because SEC hoops right now doing what it's doing. I mean, I'd be remiss if I didn't find a way to bring it into the football discussion, of course. But yeah, hope everybody is able to enjoy a ton of hoops over the course of this weekend. All right. Let's kick it to Adam. Love chatting with him. He's been all over the place with his travels this spring and always just has really good perspective. So here is Adam Breneman. Now excited to be joined by a very special guest. It is Adam Breneman. Adam, it feels like you've been everywhere over the course of the last few weeks, maybe the last month. You've basically, from my perspective, you just missed football season so much that you pretend that it just never ended.
Yeah, I do miss it, man. I do miss it. No, it's been, listen, for the stuff I'm doing with the interviews and the content, the best time to do it is once the season ends, when the coaches, I wouldn't say they have time on their hands, but they certainly have more time on their hands, and they're more likely to say yes to doing an interview and to doing a sit down. So yeah, I mean, the last few weeks I did a little North Carolina trip, went to Duke, Wake Forest. I couldn't get North Carolina to let me come interview Bill Belichick, unfortunately. But was at Michigan and had Sherrone Moore on the show, had Kenny Dillingham at Arizona State. I'm traveling on Thursday to go have Marcus Freeman on at Notre Dame. So that's going to be a really cool interview. You know, when you get the final email that's like says the guest is actually going to do the podcast, it's like a big win, you know? So my team was fired up when we got Marcus Freeman. That's kind of been a wish list one for us for a while. So yes, definitely busy. The travel does not stop once the season ends.
You mentioned the trip to go see Kenny Dillingham. Had you been back to Arizona State since your exit there? And like, if not, how surreal was that?
I had not. It was I'd not been back. It was definitely a full circle moment for me. You know, it's funny because you kind of like think to yourself going into it, oh, I wonder what it's going to be like when I go back to Arizona State. I haven't been back since the whole coaching staff got fired and we were under investigation. And you know, then you kind of remember that like you're the only one thinking about that. No one else really cares. They're just all just like they're doing their jobs. But it was definitely cool to be back because I think about where I was in my life when I left Arizona State, and the adversity and not knowing what I wanted to do and the ups and downs, and then to kind of see where I'm at now and to be invited back there to interview Kenny Dillingham, who just was coach of the year and made the college football playoff. I thought it was a really cool moment just 3 years later. It was cool because it kind of gave me that validity on overcoming the adversity and coming out on the other side and ultimately making something good out of an unfortunate situation.
Yeah, you've obviously been able to kind of turn this into your own media empire that you're growing, and then seeing also Arizona State have the success in the last year.
Yeah.
If you had gone in there and they're still struggling and they're still dealing with the fallout of everything that happened with Herm Edwards and all that, you're kind of going in there thinking, man, it sucks that it doesn't feel that different. Yeah. And instead, the mood probably was just at a different level. What's the lesson to be learned from this Dillingham hiring? Because as much as we can say, guy's only had one good season, he's got plenty of work left to do. He just made the playoff as a 34-year-old in this sport, and it's 2 years removed from all of that stuff going down in Tempe. So, like, what's your perspective on why it was so significant to see him have a season like this, given the history there?
Yeah, good question. I think there's a few things. One is, man, sometimes in the hiring process, the AD at the time was Ray Anderson. He deserves some credit here. And I think hiring Kenny Dillingham was not the easy move at all. There were a lot of other coaches on the market at the time that would have been much easier to hire, that would have been much safer of hires. But making the safe hire doesn't ever become a legendary hire. It isn't one that ever changes careers. And hiring Kenny Dillingham as a first-time head coach who's in his early 30s, who had never led a program before, was a risky move. But at the same time, there were so many reasons then that it made sense. He's an Arizona guy. He had recruited at such a high level. It felt like ASU needed something new, needed something outside the box to come out of the Herm Edwards era. And Kenny wanted that job. It's rare in college football to find someone who isn't just excited about a job because they want to be a head coach. But Kenny dreamed and grew up dreaming of becoming the head coach at Arizona State. So making the risky hire, when it pays off really well. And I think with how fast the coaching cycles move nowadays, I think more programs should make risky hires. Because if it doesn't work, you fire your coach in a year or two and you hire a new one. But if it does work with a coach like Kenny Dillingham, it's a home run. And it changes the entire energy around the program. It changes the way that the Valley in Arizona views Arizona State football has changed completely since Kenny Dillingham took over. I give him a lot of credit. I think that's a trend we're going to keep seeing in college football. When in an era where you have to win and you have to win right away, and you need to rally the fan base, you got to recruit at a high level, you have to retain your own roster, and you have to raise money. We're going to keep seeing these younger and younger, energetic coaches who maybe don't have a ton of experience, because the reality is, Connor, the experience of the last 15 years in college football doesn't matter anymore. It doesn't even help you. It's a completely different game than it was before. It's not about recruiting high school players anymore. It's about so many other things, and hiring people like Kenny Dillingham will become a trend. We're going to see it more and more in college football, I think.
The under 40 coaches, it's as good as it's ever been in college football, with Dillingham and Dan Lanning, Sharon Moore, a guy that you just went and visited in Ann Arbor, Spencer Danielson at Boise State, Marcus Freeman, a guy that you're going to be able to go and see. And there are just – I think there are a lot of people who could look at that and go, well, NIL just forces coaches to be more relatable. Since the dawn of time, we've been saying that, coaches got to be more relatable. That's why it's getting younger. But it truly feels like we're opening up the profession to a place that it really hasn't been open to in the past. You were once in that spot where you knew what it was like to be young in those meetings and talk to athletic directors who have this certain perspective of what a head coach should be. What's your viewpoint on the coaching world being younger and really acknowledging that it's not necessarily the prerequisite that 20 years of experience like it felt like it used to be?
Yeah, I mean, I love it. I think the coaching world should skew younger just by the nature of who you're interacting with. I mean, you're dealing with 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old kids, and so much of that is relatability. I think if you can find a good young coach who has some experience, but also carries themselves well and and can build a good coaching staff around them. That's the perfect combination. It's not just a young coach who's a good recruiter. It's a young coach who has a staff to put around him who understands football, who has some experience. Where like Kenny Dillingham, everyone talks about how young he is. Yes, true. But like Kenny was the OC at Florida State, at Oregon. He had been he was at Memphis with Mike Norvell. He had seen it at a really high level. So that combination is really special. I think the pro and the con there. The pro is that you get someone in a young coach who can relate to the players, who can say to the players, 10 years ago, I was in your shoes when I played, right? Or understands what the players are going through. It's a little bit easier for a player to relate to Kenny Dillingham than it is for a player to relate to a coach who's turning 60. The con there is that young coaches sometimes have trouble, or at least the perception is they have trouble managing a program. They have trouble from a discipline standpoint. Some coaches used to always say to us when I was a young coach, used to say, you got to show the players you care, but you can't be their friend. Like there's that fine line of respect. And I think some ADs, some school presidents are afraid that young coaches don't demand the respect that a 50, 60, 40-year-old coach would. I think that the great young coaches are great at balancing that line of, listen, I'm here for you. We're going to relate really well. I'm a player's coach. We're going to have fun doing what we do. But ultimately, I'm the authority figure, and you're going to respect me. And that comes from setting the standard. I asked Kenny Dillingham that in my interview with him. I said, Kenny, how do you balance that where, like, you play video games with the players? How do you make sure they respect you as a coach? He's like, because day one, if someone's 10 seconds late to my meeting, like, their ass is off the team or they're running for 7 weeks straight. Like, there's no gray area here. Like, this is my program, and here's the rules. But then the players enforce it themselves, and then Kenny can relate to the players and make sure he's there for them on a personal level.
Yeah, and that stuff internally, we don't necessarily get that full perspective. We see what Kenny Dillingham says going into the playoff about how he offered guys that wanted to transfer a roster spot and said, look, you can stay. I'll make sure you get taken care of, but we need the depth. We need you guys around. And it's, it comes off as very players coach focused for the young coach, but really there's a lot that goes into it. And there's stuff that you can do behind closed doors that's certainly different. Sherrone Moore, it's so interesting to look at his career at this stage, because Michigan is essentially doing what Ohio State wanted to do with Ryan Day. And it won't come out and never admit that, but superstar coach leaves, in-house promotion, keep the program afloat. And ideally, best case scenario, when you win a title. That's all you can really hope for when you do something like that. It's not some, Brian Kelly to LSU or Lincoln Riley to USC like splash. Think that happens for Moore at Michigan eventually?
Yeah, I think it does. The thing I noticed about Sherrone Moore, I had never really spent that much time around him. Like, I knew him from when I was coaching. He was a tight ends coach at Michigan at the time, so we had talked. We recruited Colston Loveland against each other when I was a tight ends coach at ASU. We were trying to get him. He ends up going to Michigan. Great get and evaluation by Sherrone there. But the thing with Sherrone Moore, I think it takes a unique person to step into that job after Jim Harbaugh, and to have the humility and the self-awareness to kind of make that program their own, to be okay with the fact that everyone loved Jim Harbaugh, and Jim Harbaugh did a fantastic job there. But it's not an easy guy to replace. I mean, because everyone talks about how much they love Coach Harbaugh, but at the same time, Sherrone has to build that program his own way. He has to put his own fingerprint on there somehow. And I think Sherrone's done a really good job of bringing his own energy and his own identity to Michigan football. So when you walk around that building, a lot of it is the same exact way it was when, normally when you have a coaching change, the whole building changes. The pictures look different on the wall. The slogans are different. It's all the same. But Sherrone Moore is still his own coach and comfortable in his own skin. So I think that's what's going to allow him to be successful, because the infrastructure is there at Michigan. Like the resources, the support is all there. Can your head coach rally the troops, recruit at a high level, and ultimately retain his own roster? Because everything else is going to take care of itself, in my opinion. So I think Sherrone's the right guy. Listen, this season was the ups and downs. I think he made some mistakes in the transfer portal and maybe not signing a quarterback. The landing Bryce Underwood changes the whole program, the trajectory of it moving forward. I think Sherrone's going to get it done there, and I think we'll see them win a title.
He's got to stop dressing like Harbaugh, though. Dresses too much like Harbaugh.
Too similar, right?
Like I saw your interview with him, and I'm like, dang, did he just take that out of Harbaugh's closet? We gotta change the vibes a little bit. I know you want to replicate him, and you're a Harbaugh disciple and everything, but I just looked at that. I was like, he'll find definitely his own look there. But
he tells a hilarious story when I interviewed him about how he got the tight ends job at Michigan, and just the story of like he's in the interview room. Sharon at the time was like in the MAC somewhere, I think like Central Michigan or something. And Sharon had him come to Michigan, did an interview. It was like hours long. Thought he was flying home, had a flight home, and Harbaugh's like, "Yeah, like I'll see you same time tomorrow morning. Like we'll do it again." And ran back the interview again, and he just talks about how Harbaugh had Sharon Moore like doing drills in his full suit. He's like drenched in sweat. Sharon Moore is like blocking a chair, and in the interview, Sharon's like, yeah, Coach Harbaugh was like, had a lip in, was like, run that back, show me that again. And just like had him like running through different drills that he would have the tight ends do. And then ended up hiring him after 2 days of interviews.
Worth it. Absolutely worth it. Led to a dream job, it seems like.
Yeah.
Who would you pick as the next first time national championship winning coach? List is pretty long now. I mean, 3 guys in college football that have won national titles. Who would be your pick? Because I imagine, all these under 40s are, with Lanning and Freeman. Those guys are certainly popular candidates.
Yeah, I mean, my mind goes to 2 guys. One of them you just said. I go to Dan Lanning, and then I go to James Franklin at Penn State.
Of course it does.
Yeah, but I just think like Penn State's so close. I think. Listen, I think you could call me a homer for that pick like 3 years ago. I think now, like they are so close. And 2025 with Drew Aller coming back, the fact they retained both running backs, the fact that they're making some moves in the portal at receiver, I think they still got to make some more. Penn State's just been so close the last couple of years. It feels like it's going to happen soon. And then Dan Lanning. I mean, I listen. I think Dan Lanning's got an argument to be a top 2 coach in the game right now, top 3. I mean, he's as good as they come, and the way he's building that program, the way they're recruiting, Oregon football is different, and they have some swagger under Dan Lanning. So I think Oregon gets the job done.
If Lanning is still in year 6 or year 7 at Oregon, and he hasn't been to a semifinal, the comp is going to be Franklin, and that's going to come. The 4-20 mark against AP top 10 teams, I just can't get past it. And I like we've talked about this, so we don't need to go down this road again about like we differ on Franklin. You have a much different perspective than I do, looking at it from the outside. And as a Joe Moorhead appreciator, I have certainly shared my biases on that. But
yeah,
I thought they missed Beau Pribula in that semifinal game. I thought they really could have used him, and it could have ignited the offense in ways that Drew Aller just quite frankly couldn't. And that was, to me, the most frustrating thing if you're watching that from a Penn State perspective. How badly do you think they needed him that night, and it could have changed up the mojo for their offense?
Yeah, it could have changed a lot. And the biggest thing, I mean, when Beau decided to transfer and wasn't available for that semifinal game, everyone kind of kept saying like, well, it's the backup quarterback. How important can it be? I was on one of the shows I do. I was like, man, like Beau Pribula is a guy who touches the football a few times a game for Penn State. And like, you got to think like a few touches a game is a lot. I mean, sometimes your best receiver gets 5 touches a game. Like that's
0 in a, semifinal game.
Exactly. The great point. Well, that's where I was going with this next. Beau Pribula meant a lot to this Penn State offense. And one of the biggest reasons was because of the lack of receiver talent that Penn State had. I think, for all the things that James Franklin's done right, and I love Coach Franklin, I think he's done a great job, as you know. I think one of the big misses this past season was not signing an elite wide receiver. They signed Julian Fleming, who ended up not even being a contributor for most of the year. He had a couple big catches, but especially against in the USC game. But for the most part, didn't play much of a role. Lost Keandre Lambert Smith to the portal for a variety of reasons. But listen, when everyone in the stadium knows you need to throw the football, there has to be someone who can win and get open and win one-on-one. And you watch the film back of that semifinal game, there is never a moment where there's an ounce of separation created by a receiver. There's separation created by route concepts, and that's where Andy Kotelnicki has to keep improving and getting those route concepts better. But Never once is there separation from a Penn State receiver. And on that interception, the final Penn State offensive player of the game, when Drew Aller threw the pick, and he's going to get all the criticism as he should. He's the quarterback, and he's got to be better than that. You can't throw that ball. But the mistake there was Penn State trying to score at the end of the game there with a tie ball game. That go to overtime where you can use your 12 personnel, run the football, play your style of offense with a minute on the clock, and you're backed up on your own 20, and you don't have a single receiver who can win. You're putting your 5-star quarterback in a terrible position where Drew Aller now feels like he has to go make a play. And listen, not having a better receiving core for Drew Aller is a disservice to your 5-star quarterback. There's just no other way to put it. Not having someone who can win one-on-one is inexcusable, and it cost Penn State that game. They should have been playing in the national championship.
Before I get to, because I do have more things I want to get to you with Beau Pribula and what Mizzou fans are getting with him. Keandre Lambert-Smith, you hinted at it. What happened there? Because for him to leave that situation where he could have been the top receiver post-spring to sign up to play with Peyton Thorne and then to play really well with Peyton Thorne, it's one of the more head-scratching things, especially if you know the history of Auburn receivers and how they've really struggled to have those guys excel, pre-draft and all that stuff as well. Make sense of it, because I have not been able to.
Yeah, I do not know, to be totally. I don't know the whole story, to be honest with you. Listen, Penn State's really good at keeping things under wraps that don't get leaked out to the media.
That's true.
I don't know. It doesn't make a ton of sense. As any transfer does nowadays in college football, my guess is that it has something to do with NIL money. That's like seems to be the safest assumption there. It certainly wasn't because it wasn't for the quarterback play or something like that. I mean, it probably was financially motivated. And listen, I think. I don't have a great answer for what actually happened with Keandre, but I know this, that Keandre was a talented player. I don't know how he was off the field. I don't know how he fit in with the locker room at Penn State. I wasn't there. But, Keandre is very talented, and I think Penn State missed having a wide receiver with that kind of juice.
What is Mizzou getting with Beau Pribula as its QB1 for next year?
Beau is, first of all, he's a great person, unbelievable leader. Like, the players at Penn State love Beau Pribula. I know that the sentiment around the locker room, like, there's very few people at Penn State that James Franklin and those players would let stay on the team during bowl practices or during playoff practices, knowing they were transferring. Beau was one of them that they would have let stay around knowing he was going to transfer. The issues ended up being logistically, like he was taking visits and couldn't come to practice, so he ended up leaving the team. At the most places, if you enter the portal, you're not coming to practice anymore in the semifinal week. That's how much respect that program has for Beau. I mean, Beau's a Central PA guy, grew up down the street from me. He's tough. He's gritty. He's extremely smart. His brother Cade was a great player at Delaware, played quarterback, great family. I think Beau checks every box off the field. He is a unbelievable athlete running the football. He's got some swagger, and he's got a great elusiveness to him. But man, he is just as good throwing the football. Everyone talks about how he's kind of a dual threat quarterback and he's good in the zone read game, and I think he is. But I've seen him in person at some of those spring practices in fall camp. He can zip the ball now. Like, he has some serious juice on his arm, and I think that Penn State's done a really good job developing him into more of a bigger pocket guy that can stand in the pocket and deliver the ball down the field. He feels like that perfect fit of, you want the guy who's mobile, who can play in the zone read game, who can make throws off balance, who can make off-platform throws, who can kind of play shortstop at quarterback. But you also got to be able to, in the 2-minute drill, deliver the ball down the field on 3-step and 5-step drops. And Beau can really do it all. I think Beau is a potential NFL player. I think, like, when he first got to Penn State, people were kind of, is he going to play safety? Where is he really going to fit in? Beau has developed into a true quarterback, and Missouri is getting a really good one. Saw that clearly. I mean, the market for Beau was pretty hot now. A lot of teams went after him to be their starting quarterback, and Penn State did a good job developing him.
If the market wasn't hot, he stays on that Penn State team throughout the playoff, and he just says, you know what, I'll just see what it looks like post-spring. Maybe I help myself a little bit there, but when the market is that hot, you got to make a move like that. No doubt. I'll tie this back to Penn State then. Because I think right now with what he's been asked to do, and that's a different conversation than what he's capable of doing. Yeah. I think he looks like what Will Levis looked like at Penn State. And then before he transferred, goes to the biomechanics expert and becomes the thrower that we know him to be today.
Yeah.
Is he more of a post Penn State Will Levis, or is Beau Pribula more of a peak Penn State Trace McSorley?
Oh, well, this is a good question. I think he's more of a peak Penn State Trace McSorley. I think the difference is, I think Beau's playing style is much more similar to Trace, and in how now I would say Beau maybe is a little bit of a better like true pocket passer than Trace was at Penn State. I mean, Trace was very much off platform, shots down the field, check down or touchdown, was a big play guy at quarterback. I think Beau has the ability to kind of be that tweener who can take the shots on the field, who can escape, but also can stay in the pocket and hit a dig route 15 yards in the middle of the field in stride, in timing, with good timing in the pocket, where that was never really Trace's strength. And I think Beau is just more athletic and better improvising and better off schedule than Will Levis was. So I would go more towards a Trace comparison for Beau.
Last one for you.
Yep.
I think I'm ready to end all future comps to Brock Bowers and even Tyler Warren. And I would still say that Bowers ended up being the better college player than Tyler Warren. But yep. I'm anticipating the future comps of those two guys, and I'm already kind of sick of it. And I'm just like, what are we really doing here, guys? You have more authority than I do to make the declaration that we just need to stop those comps before they really get going. Could you get behind a motion like that? Just say, you know what? If you're thinking about comparing a tight end to Brock Bowers or Tyler Warren, just find somebody else.
Yeah. Or like NFL wise, can we stop with the George Kittle comparisons for everybody? Yeah. I mean, every tight end is a George Kittle comp. So it's, listen, when you're a tight end, it's like an honor to get compared to those guys. When I was playing, it was Gronk. Everyone was Rob Gronkowski. Every college coach who recruited me, oh, you're going to be just like Gronk. You're going to be just like Gronk. I'm like, can we come up with something more original than Gronk?
Look, you know what? There are worse comps to get, and I'll spare the people who are currently self-dubbing those nicknames, but the comps that you probably got, it had to be pretty significant, like even beyond just like the Gronk stuff, because I imagine Northeast at that time, you're hearing a lot of that, but was there one that you heard and you just thought to yourself, I'm not like that guy at all? And that's the worst thing I've ever heard.
Aaron Hernandez. I don't know. Is that podcast appropriate?
That's fine. That's fine.
Yeah.
Man.
Well, that was actually before Bill O'Brien had just come from the Patriots, and that was like before obviously all that stuff happened with Aaron Hernandez. And he had just had Gronk and Hernandez. So and Bill O'Brien was bringing this 2 tight end system to Penn State. So like the comparison the whole time was like, you're Gronk, you're Hernandez. Like we're the 2 tight ends at Penn State. And I wore 81 at Penn State, Aaron Hernandez, 81 at the Patriots.
I see it.
And I was playing that like off ball move tight end that Aaron Hernandez was playing. And so I always make that joke that like my comp at Penn State was Aaron Hernandez. And then I would say to Bill O'Brien, like, you still sure about that comp?
Adam, definitely not Aaron Hernandez, just slightly different. Really,
you did not think I was going that route with the comp.
You know, I really didn't. I wouldn't have made that connection before. I think you know what? Let's include Aaron Hernandez in that comp. No more comps to Aaron Hernandez, Brock Bowers, Tyler Warren. They are officially off the table.
I love it.
Adam, really appreciate it, man. Safe travels with everything you got going on.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
All right, well, let's close with some lad of the week. Want me to go first? I got a madness one.
Go for it.
The madness on Tuesday night. Micah Simpson. Might not know who Micah Simpson is. That's okay.
Okay.
The Alabama State point guard. See the point guard? He's the quarterback. He tossed the Grant Hill-like pass, full court, game-winning bucket of the play-in game involving the 16 seeds. Yes, I said Grant Hill, not Jaden Daniels, for obvious reasons. We don't need to go there. It's still a very sore subject. Great story on ESPN.com by Adam Rittenberg about this. He was a middle school quarterback, high school career. He switches to corner and receiver in the state of Tennessee. Keep that in mind. Apparently he does this all the time. Say it again.
I said Pruitt's fault. I was just kidding.
I don't think he's that old.
Oh, yeah.
I think Heupel can get some blame for that. He's like, hey, why didn't you recruit this kid who was a middle school quarterback, dude? Like, what are you doing?
Come on.
But apparently he does this all the time in practice. And they just dial up this type of look. And, the guy, I mean, just absolutely aced that throw in that spot, which is more difficult than people give it credit for. And I'm sure Auburn, hoping that he is not in position to do the exact same thing in that 116 matchup on Thursday. But this is why March is so awesome.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that scene was bananas, and it was a game involving 16 seeds. And now a SWAC school gets to go face the big in-state program, the number 1 overall seed, at Rupp Arena in the NCAA tournament. And I'll just say this. A couple of football programs in the state of Alabama, not the one in Tennessee, but the 2 that you know of in the state of Alabama, working through quarterback battles. I'm not saying he's to be a QB1, but our guy Micah Simpson, Hail Mary specialist. Can we just give it a try? That's what Joe Milton's future in the NFL is. There's a place for it. I'm legitimately serious that there should be Hail Mary specialists, because there are certain starting quarterbacks that cannot throw a Hail Mary for the life of them. But Jalen Hurts being one of them. But I'm just saying, Mike Simpson, give him a shot.
Yeah, to your point, like, I think March is like this beautiful time of the year where we get to see people, for the first time and kind of like only time, and it's for their accomplishments. And this is going to sound unrelated, but the other day I was watching a documentary on Leroy Jenkins, the famous World of Warcraft video. And that guy, Leroy Jenkins, didn't make any money off of being famous back in the day. And so I say that to say it's pretty cool now that, we used to have these guys who might get like a local ad or like one little spotlight of fame. Now kids like that have the ability to build a brand, build a profile, and actually make something of this. So pretty cool stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I love the post March Madness NIL things that we get now. What was the St. Peter's guard who had the Buffalo Wild Wings deal? Like immediately, Jack Golke last year. Sorry, Kentucky fans. Immediately had stuff lined up, ready to go. That Micah Simpson throwing something in a commercial in the very near future. I'm just make it happen, TB execs.
Line it up. So obviously it is March Madness season, and I quickly realized that if I was going to give it to a person, it would have had to be Rick Pitino, so we're not doing that. Instead,
I had Rick Pitino first on mine, and then I decided I'll go in a different direction.
Right. So instead, I'm doing a little bit of good news here. Something that's very important to me, also very important to you as a volunteer. Big Brothers Big Sisters is returning to New Orleans for the first time since Hurricane Katrina. Really big deal. Like I said, that's an organization that you do some great work with. It says here that there is a 7% increase in Black males who are now volunteering, critical demographic. So we'd love to see that, especially in New Orleans. We've seen some great things and outreaches in New Orleans, and that pipeline has been such a big part of our state and part of LSU and part of the Saints organization, who have been really like big in terms of change and uplifting people from the community. So I think it's cool to see, the city's still healing, and New Orleans will never be the same from Katrina. And obviously we had the, horrific terrorist attack on New Year's this year. And so New Orleans, it feels like, is always being dealt. It was one of the strongest battles, but it's one of the world's most beautiful cities. So it's really cool to see people doing the right thing in their local community and that part of the goodness coming back.
Was the first organization I was involved in outside of our company in Orlando, and got to see the great work that they do. Big Brothers Big Sisters is fantastic. Unfortunately, I was in a situation where it's a two-way street with the commitment, and that's some of the challenges that you run into sometimes. But it is a reminder of how many kids need help and how many kids need that direction. And unfortunately, 2019 that's when I switched from Big Brothers Big Sisters to now doing stuff with New Hope for Kids. But it was not a reflection at all of what Big Brothers Big Sisters does, because it is tremendous. It needs to be in every city in America. Didn't even realize that they weren't in New Orleans, but I mean, it just goes to show you like how needed that stuff is. It's difficult to make it happen when you don't feel like you have the resources to be able to pour into it, but hopefully that's going to impact a lot of lives. And I'm sure many people listening to this have been fortunate enough to be involved with them as well.
Heck yeah, man.
All right. Well, that's a pod. That'll do it. Madness. Maybe people are listening to this post madness, and that's going to sound really dated. Maybe the SEC got just shelled in the opening weekend, and there's like 2 SEC teams left. That'd be a tough look. That'd be a really tough look. People are like, why do they talk about whether or not the SEC basketball brand was going to ever overtake football? That'd be a weird thing to talk about.
Look at this, man. This is why it's March Peace for LSU fans. I have no expectations. All I get is hopium about us spending a bunch of money in NIL. This is a dream for me. My team is out of expectation land.
Look at us, just our teams deciding to sit out the NCAA tournament. We're not built for that.
We're focused on football. It's no worries, bro. And baseball and whatever else we're into. Yeah, walking the dog, whatever.
Swimming school, soccer school. Yeah, all of these other things. If you haven't, please leave us a 5-star review. Subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can watch every single episode of the Saturday Down South podcast. Follow us on Twitter at the SDS Pod, at Set Down South, at CJ O'Gara, at Go So Hard. Thanks, guys. Talk soon.